Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. On this podcast, I'm here to try to help you turn whatever idea you have in your head, or maybe you're working on a first draft, your second book, whatever it is, and to make a compelling fantasy story that people will actually read and enjoy. Now, I know a lot of people have been reaching out on the podcast, and they're coming at this from all different angles. There are some folks who are really interested in traditional publishing. There are some folks who are totally on board for self-publishing, or even just writing something that's really only intended for their friends and family. And you know what? No matter what corner of this you're trying to tackle, whether you want to be that prestigious author who is giving a speech at a professional university kind of setting. I don't know why I said professional university, but you understand. Whether you're that sort of person, or you're somebody who just has that itch, right, to put out a bunch of books, whether they just be ebooks, whatever. Either way, I think that we all tend to share something in common, which is that you want to turn your idea into something that is special, that other people will see as special too. And you'll notice the core of the advice that I typically give on this show, it usually boils down to what's in your head. There's something amazing there. All you really need to do is to figure out the best way to translate that idea into a language that readers broadly will be able to understand and appreciate as much as you, if not more. I know I've said this before. There's nothing quite like writing something and people getting something out of what you've written in a way that transcends what you intended. That's how I felt when I first wrote the Pixar theory back in 2012, I think it was, 2013. And I remember writing that, and I was just having fun. Then for people to be like, oh my gosh, like this was an amazing, experience, or like it really meant a lot to a bunch of people. And I was like, man, that's so cool, because that's not what I set out to do necessarily. I just wanted to have fun and for other people to have fun with it. And sure, that happened. But then for people to also find some kind of meaning in it, some kind of warmth and coziness with it as well, that's really what made it for me. And so that's the experience that I want other people to have as well with whatever book they're writing, but specifically fantasy, because this is a fantasy writing podcast and it's going to be for forever. It'll never change. All right, so we have a prompt here. As usual on the show, our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, found a prompt for me. She only sent me one this time. She said she is confident that I'm going to enjoy this prompt and we're not going to shift to another one. Although, again, I've mentioned this before, we've only shifted prompts one time in 16 or so episodes. And so I am very curious, because Natalia isn't usually this confident, right? And at least when it comes to prompts, she's confident in other things, of course, like her intelligence and her reasoning skills. But anyway, as usual, I'm going to read the prompt unscripted. I'm going to look at this for the first time, react to it off the cuff. And then our other wonderful producer, Bridget Surdock, is going to basically just give me some notes and let me know if I got anything wrong. Okay. So this is from username Shoddy Elephant 8924. Love that username. And this was written in the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. So Shoddy Elephant writes, what do you want more or less of in female fantasy leads? I'm currently in the progress of writing a fantasy book, unsure yet of the age range, and I'm still at the beginning stages of developing my characters. My main character will be a female, and while developing her, I knew that I wanted my story to try to break a few typical stereotypes or cliches. I have thought of a few types, but I wanted to get the opinions from others who may want to see things less seen, even if it isn't in a protagonist but a storyline. I think that's what they're trying to say. Don't get me wrong, I still want some cliche things as well in my story. This is also adding that I'd like to add enemies to lovers, but I'd like to know some things that you may find a bit too common or overly used, and what would you like to see a little more that may be a lot less used or rare, whether it be personality, their traits, their powers, their background, anything at all. It'll be a big help, as I sometimes accidentally write a character that starts off immediately weak, short and skinny, and as much as I love that, I think and feel like there's maybe more to expand on or something refreshing that can be written. Yeah, so just starting with that last point, the idea of the female protagonist being weak, short, skinny, and like her paramour being this big, brawny dude, it is so overdone. It is way too cliche. It's something that I've noticed a lot of readers have been asking for less of. A lot of readers have been saying, can we please move away from this? If you're going to do it, like, can this be a bit more sparing? Because it's happening in so many books, particularly very like popular books, to be clear. And so I would shy away from that just from you're trying to, if your goal, of course, is to be traditionally published, and it sounds like this person is trying to be cognizant of what readers want right now, and trends change, but right now, readers want less of that because they feel like it's so saturated. And so that would be my first piece of advice. Let me take this step by step because I have a lot of reactions to this. So you're still at the beginning stage and you write that you're not sure yet of the age range. Well, I would at the very least, before you start drafting, you should probably try to settle on at least a category of age. So either middle grade, YA, or adult. Or you could try, to gear it toward new adult. To be clear, new adult isn't something that you would probably position to an agent because most agents don't really take new adult very seriously. It's really going to be either YA or adult. And your age range can flex there, right? You can write an adult fantasy that you think will appeal to teenagers. That's the kind of thing that I do, honestly. But there's a big difference between YA and adult when it comes to the type of story that people expect. People expect from YA a certain writing style, tone, and voice that is a little bit more, be careful here, but it's going to be like a little bit more surface level in some ways. YA can be very good, don't get me wrong, but in terms of like the tone and the seriousness, like it can be serious, but it's usually going to be a little bit more like straightforward in certain respects in terms of the character journey. A lot of YA is about coming of age. A lot of it is about a character who is trying to become an adult in their mindset. Whereas adult fantasy they're going to be a little bit more progressed. You can have an adult fantasy, for example, where the character is maybe 10 years old and you kind of like walk through and they get a little bit older and you have a coming of age too there in some respects, but really the tone is going to define it being adult because of the seriousness of the situations they find themselves in. You can even have adult fantasy that is very YA, where the character might be like 20 years old, but it has kind of a YA style to it. It's one of those things where you know it when you read it. And I'm trying to define it, but like there are so many exceptions that as soon as I say an example, then you're like, but this book kind of defies that. So it's very squishy. And a lot of people are just like, well, what does the cover look like? That's how I'll know. Sure. But that's the reason I typically just go for adult fantasy, because I think that adult fantasy, first of all, is something that I personally find myself a little bit more like comfortable writing, that kind of tone, that kind of voice. But I mean, the last book that I wrote is very, in some ways, like some people have said that, oh yeah, this feels like a bridge, for YA because it has some YA tendencies, somebody once told me. And so, yeah, it's never going to be perfect, but yeah, in terms of your age range, at least have some kind of expectation at the beginning of like, okay, are you just thinking maybe like teenagers and people in their early 20s? It doesn't necessarily need to be that defined yet, but that'll help you a lot in terms of deciding big key questions about your main character, because whether it's YA or adult is really going to affect what your major dramatic question is and what your major abstract question is. So for those of you who haven't heard other episodes of this podcast, your major dramatic question is going to be like the big driving question of the book as it relates to the main character. So in terms of, let's do an example here, the Poppy War. So the major dramatic question is, will Rin be able to be a successful student at the Sign Guard, military academy? And the major abstract question, it's a little bit more of an internal sort of conflict, which is like, is she going to be able to accept her limitations or overcome the sexism that she encounters in a hostile world? That's a major abstract question, essentially. So those are things, though, that like that's what makes it adult fantasy, the seriousness of these situations. Whereas like a YA romance, for example, is going to be like, is the main character going to get are they going to get the girl? Are they going to get the guy? The abstract question is, are they going to accept, their cultural background? So I'm thinking of like, Pile Metal's Romance Revenge Plot by Preeti Chibber, a friend of mine. And so, yeah, that's the kind of thing that really affects what's YA and what's adult, or at least gets you started. Anyway, okay, that was a long tangent. I'm sorry. So they said their main character is going to be a female. I never like saying like this person is a male, a female. Just say boy, girl, guy. And while developing her, I knew that I wanted my story to try to break a few typical stereotypes or cliches. So I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with having this mindset of like, okay, I want to make sure I don't fall into stereotypes, but just be careful that you are not your creativity is not being dictated by subversion. So you're not making creative decisions just based on what's been done before. Sometimes you need to let these things come about a little more organically. Sometimes you find a character when you are just dreamscaping, when you're brainstorming, when you're daydreaming, I should say, who they are, and like letting them come onto the page. Because if you just try to be like, I'm going to make this character a bit, less like a princess sort of character, and it's like, it's not always the best starting point. One good thing that I like to, like a technique I like to use is I like to start from a place of what if I took a popular character I like in a TV show or a movie or an anime, and I changed like 5 things about, but I kept 5 other things about them. So just as a starting point, and usually I deviate way, way, way far away from that kind of thing over the course of the story, and I settle on who the character really is. But that can just help you map this stuff out in a way without, so you're being, I guess, a little bit stereotypical and maybe in some ways, but you can pick that off as you go, I guess. I have thought of a few types, but I wanted to get the opinions from others who may want to see some things less. Okay, yeah. So I guess they're trying to say, like, what are things that you want to see less of? And yeah, I understand this, but I've done this, I guess, in some cases. I think this can be a trap when you outsource the internet for what do you want to see or what do you want to see less of? Just because, first of all, we don't have any context for your story. We don't really know anything about your book itself. You're going to get a bunch of things, and then you're going to try to write away from those things. And again, if you let external factors and circumstances dictate so many facets of your story, it's going to lose its life. It's not going to feel like your story anymore. It's going to feel a little bit more like homework. It's going to feel like not like a story you want to tell, but a story you think other people want to read, which there's a fine line. You do want to keep your readers in mind. You do want to like watch out for that stuff. And I say that as somebody who in the past, like I've definitely done some research and into like, what's something that is being overdone in fantasy or whatever right now that I should try to avoid. A lot of the time though, I do this after I'm done with the first draft. And the reason is because I just don't want my opinions and my creative output to be tainted by external forces. It's the same kind of thing when I review a film. I don't want to read film reviews by other critics before I've written mine, because if I do that, my opinion is, there's no going back. Like my opinion is going to be tainted by other people's opinions, and it's going to stop being my own. So again, fine line. And it's one of those things where I think you're better off like just writing your story, working on it, and keeping these things in the back of your head and reading a lot of novels so you can answer these questions yourself, right? Like if you read enough, you can have an idea of what's out there, and you should be doing that. And you can, maybe preemptively avoid some of these stereotypes and cliches. But then in addition to that, what you can do is at the very end, like once you have written a draft, or maybe you've written half the book, whatever it is, and you can share it maybe with somebody you trust, some critique partners, beta readers, you can let them sort of let you know. Right? If they pick up on something where it's like, hey, you wrote this whole scene, it's not really clicking because this character is just kind of, maybe this character just isn't like working for me, or like they're not making sense logically, or I've seen this happen in another fantasy novel recently. You can rely on people around that time to give you more specific feedback rather than getting overwhelmed by a bunch of feedback to something you haven't even written yet, if that makes sense. And in terms of gender, so I don't know the gender of the person who is writing this, right? I'm not going to make any assumptions, but I'm just going to say like I am a male author, so I am a male. But no, I'm a male author, and I typically write female protagonists. And one thing that I've run into while writing female protagonists is there are going to be blind spots. I don't have a female experience, as part of my upbringing. I'm writing about a gender that I don't have firsthand experience, which means I'm going to have gaps. I'm going to have blind spots. And I have definitely been in this situation where my critique partner has let me know, like, hey, I absolutely, don't blame me for not noticing this because you're a man. And so you haven't gone through this yourself. But like if this character you wrote was in this situation, I don't buy their reaction, because if they are a woman in this kind of world, they would absolutely be feeling a different sort of way than I think you expect. And that was a blind spot, right? I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I didn't even consider that. Like I knew the context of that. It made sense to me, but it's just something that didn't occur to me because I have these like default sort of assumptions about life based on, living life as a man. And there are certain things that, for example, men just don't have to worry about as much in today's society because men are not constantly in danger from other men. we're just sometimes in danger from other men, if that makes sense. But a lot of the time, like, it doesn't even register for me. So sometimes that's why a beta reader or a critique partner, somebody can really help you, catch those things. And in terms of writing a female main character as a male author too, one thing that I've been told by like editors and stuff is that well, for one thing, they've told me that they appreciate I don't go too far into writing a female character in very outlandish ways that feels like a male author writing a female character. But specifically, I remember Kate Bronning, who's been on the show, my mentor, she told me that she was impressed with how, like, my main character, one of my recent novels, she felt like I had written her in a bit of like more of a gender fluid way. And she said that, honestly, like I can tell this is a woman, but it doesn't feel like a man wrote her because you found ways to make her a little bit more genderless, or you gave her qualities that didn't feel like a reaction to the idea of gender. So essentially, like that whole thing where you'll read a book and like there's the strong female character, and the strong female character will just be good at everything. And like there's this kind of like patronizing quality to it. It's like, this story is ridiculous because in this story, it really is fantasy. The woman is strong. Like that is kind of like the feeling that people get because they're like, yeah, there's not much to this character except, the interesting thing about this character is a woman warrior. Oh my gosh, whoa. I've never even thought of that before. Like it's the kind of thing that makes like Wonder Woman, for example, such a lasting mythos in our consciousness. But all that to say, like your characters have to have like complex layers to them. And sometimes there are going to be like interchangeable things between men and women in your fantasy, depending on the type of world you're creating. For example, if your world is like a sexist world where women don't have as many opportunities and you're a male author, I would probably shy away from that framing. Quite honestly, I go out of my way to not write about gender issues. Because again, that is just something that I'm never going to be the best able to write. I'm going to be much better at writing these sort of societies where it is fantasy. So like gender isn't necessarily like something that is all that pernicious in the world. It's something that exists for sure. And I do have that in some books, like as sort of like a sub theme, but it's definitely not the focus because I'm just not going to be as nuanced at that. Now I know, so there are some people who might say like, well, George R. R. Martin kind of does this. And I would argue, look, I don't love criticizing the guy because he wrote such a prolific fantasy series that so many people like. But if one of the things I don't like about the Song of Ice and Fire novels is that I think some of the commentary on sexism and the way he handles it is not that good. It's actually in some cases pretty infuriating the way he writes female characters in some respects. It's a mixed bag. There are times when he does it really well. There are times when I think it's god awful. And so I wouldn't, use that as like the end all be all. I think this is something that Robert Jordan got a little bit better at over the course of Wheel of Time. But oh man, some of those early novels of Wheel of Time and in throughout, like the whole thing, he really messes up with it. Like there are times where it just doesn't quite click. I think for me, I kind of subscribe to the Brandon Sanderson method where it's there, like sexism is there with a book like Mistborn or Steelheart, stuff like that, but it's just not the driving force. It's not the main thing that the book is concerned with because it's a fantasy setting where there are other forces at play, that you can relate to the gender question in terms of like slavery or in terms of oppression. And in the case of my book, oppression, colonization, and things like that. So all that to say, when it comes to stereotypes and cliches, I think what's a better way to look at it is not to overly concern yourself with things that have been done before, but to just take your novel as it is and worry a little bit less about, I guess, like making it feel, like the perfect female character that nobody's read before, and instead just making it an authentic storyline. In some cases, like I'm trying to be careful with this because on the one hand, I don't want to say that like it should be like your main character could just be switched to a man and there'd be no difference. Like that should not be the case, but it should feel like if you did, change the gender of the main character, that the differences won't be so dramatic or that it won't like either like make the main character way too different. I'm not even sure exactly what I'm trying to say there, but it's a little complicated and I'm trying very hard not to give bad advice because this is just one of those things that it's hard to speak broadly about. It really depends on the book. It really depends on the circumstances. There have been times when I have, I've noticed like people will only write a female main character because they think, well, that's the only way this book is going to find an agent, or That's the only way, because most people reading these books are women. And to that, I say, don't worry about that. Like, if you are feeling like your main character should be a guy or whatever, like, then write a guy. Like, don't just write a female main character because you think that's what people want. Again, it's like you're letting other people dictate the story you want to write. All that stuff is going to work itself out. If you think that you have less of a chance you're trying to make assumptions about publishing in that way, first of all, you don't know the publishing world, as like, you're making assumptions about the publishing world. You're not in it. And also, you should have a good reason to write a character that, your character is always going to be different from you in a lot of respects. For me, a lot of the time, the character who's most like me in my books is not the main character. Usually it's a character who's kind of in the periphery, like a side character or a secondary kind of protagonist. And most of the time, I am purposely trying to write main characters that are closer to being like an audience surrogate. And because I think that I'm a bit weird. And so like I want, my main character to be more relatable than I would be. The reason that I write female main characters, it's not because I think that that's going to make me more successful as a writer. I think that writing female characters, it's just, for me, it's a lot more fun. I think that female characters in fantasy just seem to be inherently more interesting because I grew up reading so many fantasy novels with male characters. And so I think that there's just so much ground to cover in investigating the complexity of women in this kind of context. And to me, it just feels more fresh. It feels more exciting. And I know you might say, like, well, there's so many books that have female main characters these days. I'm like, yeah, that's true. But, compare that to, there's still a lot of fantasy stories with male main characters. And also that's how it used to always be all the time. So we're really just kind of in like a bit of a correction period, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think in the general question here about their personality, their traits, their powers, background, all that stuff, this is something, and I don't like how this person, is, again, it just feels like they're trying to get other people to make decisions for them in terms of like, what their character is like. I think a better way to approach this is to be like, I have this idea for a character, come up with a character already, the personality and everything, and then investigate of like, all right, but is this cliche? Is this, it starts at like, it's coming off like they haven't really done the work yet, and they're trying to do a brainstorming kind of thing ahead of time. And so it might be that misreading that, and they have this character figured out, but they just don't want to reveal that yet. But that just makes the job harder for those of us who are trying to give some feedback. So with that said, let's look at some of the comments and see what other people have to say. So Lisu24 writes, you have to write the character that suits your story and goals. But here's my 2 cents. Before I go, yes, the character that suits your story, that's true. That's true. So for example, if the story is, trying to get across, like, let's go back to Poppy War. The story of that one is like overwhelming odds, sexist society. So when it comes to the character traits, Rin is not like traditionally, Rin is kind of like masculine in some ways in terms of like her, kind of like, or not masculine. She rejects kind of femininity in a lot of key ways and kind of leans a little bit more toward like the conventional masculine mindset. And that's something that's informed by her backstory. She is purposely trying to run away from, the traumas that kind of affected her upbringing. And also, she is somebody who like, she's not like the strongest person, like muscle wise, but she's clever and she uses her body type. And in terms like she uses advantages of her body type to win the day. But anyway, Lucy24 writes, personally, I'm sick to death of 18 or 19-year-old girls as protagonists in adult fantasy novels. Of course, if the audience is younger, then the protagonist should almost always be young. But if it's a book for adults, I want to read about a grown woman with life experience. Give me a 30-something or middle-aged woman who has seen some things and has developed some skills. Nettle and Bone and the Broken Earth trilogy were great for this, in my opinion. Yeah, I definitely agree with this. I feel like there has been an overabundance of like sort of late teen, early 20s adult protagonists. And a lot of the reason this happens is because there are books that are trying to appeal to both YA and adult. And there's a limited audience pool, or at least there was. I think it's starting to change, but there was a limited audience pool of like people who were in their teens who weren't willing to read books about 30-year-old women, but instead like they want to read books about people who are like aged 15 to 21 or something like that. And so like a lot of authors responded to this in kind and tried to sort of be like, all right, I'll write an adult fantasy, but it'll also appeal to people who like YA as well. So that's usually what why that happens. But again, I do think it's starting to slowly shift a bit. We're starting to see more and more books that are, especially like cozy fantasy, where the main character, owns a bookshop or they have some, God Killer is a good example of this. Like, she isn't super young. She is like experienced. She's seen some things. And I think in that case too, like in God Killer, I don't even think she's that old, but you feel it. Like, you can buy that she's a little bit older than what her literal age might be. And that's what makes her interesting. She doesn't come off as like fresh out of high school, naive. Those are more of the traits that people associate, with the 18, 19-year-old, whatever. That's similar in my book. Like in my adult fantasy, I have a character who's just 17, but she doesn't act like a 17-year-old. She's been through a lot of like wild, difficult things. So she's a little bit more, established. And that's what makes it more adult. Like, she's already come of age. She just had to grow up really fast. And like, that's sort of, how that works. Kata writes, I think that the focus should be less on following versus breaking cliches and more about what makes this character interesting. Exactly. So yeah, that's exactly what I've been trying to say. Don't worry about, like, you don't want to make the character interesting by focusing on what they're not. You want to focus on what they are. That's where the interesting stuff comes in. Exactly. If you're working off a checklist, regardless of whether or not you choose to subvert, it'll feel checklisty. Checklisty. I like that word. It's also worth remembering that at this point, the subversions have been done 1,000 times too. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you might think that you're being super original just because you're avoiding cliches, but you're not going to be the first person to avoid those cliches. It's just, there's going to be an example of somebody else breaking the rule before you did. Probably a lot of people. So again, yeah, it's kind of not a waste of time, but it just feels like a waste of energy, really, like a waste of like worrying about this sort of thing, when in a lot of cases, it's not going to matter that much. And then they continue, for me, it's less about we need more protagonists with wings and more a question of how the protagonist's abilities, their internal, external conflicts, strengths, and weaknesses come together in an interesting way to create questions and complexity. Yeah, that's why what I was trying to say before about like taking a character maybe from fiction that you like and just tweaking things about them, because when you add some new things to the character and take some things away, then you start combining things and you start to find like, oh, this is an interesting setup for this character. So like an example could be like, I'm going to take the character of Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And what if I put her in like a sci-fi, haunted space station thing? And I just took away like 2 or 3 other personality traits and then added a couple. Boom, you have a character to start with. Not the character itself, but you have a starting point. You have something to kind of be like, ooh, now I have something that can be pretty interesting. One more. Let's do one more here. WNVSIF writes, not exactly a book, but I find this video essay on how female characters are written in the animated series Arcane, in which the main cast is mostly female-led, really lays out a few issues and mistakes that really bugged me, but even more so gives examples of how the show fixed some cliches or even used certain tropes to the advantage of the writing. So they link to a video post here. It's called How Arcane Writes Women. So I haven't seen this video. I do like Arcane. Arcane is actually one of my comps for one of my books. And I agree, Arcane, the way that Arcane writes women is so fascinating because it's really about contrasting women. And that's something that a lot of male authors slip up with. They only like, they'll have their main character be a woman, and then all the other characters with depth and personality are men. And so but a lot of the female experience is like the contrasting between, women characters and how they interplay and everything. And Arcane does this really well because that's like so much of the story. They also write, I think the most interesting thing it deals with is female characters in relation to men. Oh, which is the opposite of what I just said. But I guess that's true too. I think it's important that when writing female characters that they are able to showcase their ability without being put in comparison to a man, i.e. I can do it better than them. Okay, so I see what there's. Yes, that is a big thing too, for sure. It's a big pain when female characters are basically put on a pedestal for the pure fact of them being female. But the video really does go in depth with a bunch of nuance and character examples, so I really do suggest you check it out. Yeah, that is, and yes, the person who made the video is Schnee, SCHNEE, according to this commenter. And yeah, that's what I was trying to say too about like when my mentor was telling me that like the thing that she liked about my character was that her being a woman isn't what makes her special. It's part of her identity, and her overall identity is what's special. Whereas sometimes I think authors try to shortcut, like gender as a way of making a character interesting. Like I was saying before, it's like, what's interesting about this character? They're really tough, but get this, they're also woman. Like that's the kind of thing where it's like, okay, like you're so obsessed with gender. Can you just relax? Whereas like, yeah, sometimes you just don't need to go that far. Kinsey Mythical Zero writes, less I'm a strong, independent bitch who pushes everyone away. Know the difference between banter and being an ASS, then aim for the former. Also, fewer teens. Tired of this kids acting like adults trend the last decade or so. Give us some heroes who are at least old enough to drink. Yeah, the whole like, I'm strong and independent. I push everybody away. I think like the other way for this is like the stubbornness. I think that trope can still be done well, but the problem is that a lot of people use it to shortcut the reluctant hero and they just make them stubborn to the point of being stupid. That's the thing that's more annoying. And like the girl boss thing, of like their tragic flaw is that they want to be successful. And it's like, I don't know, it's a little overdone. And then in this case too, it's like, I'm going to be mean because then nobody can hurt me. It's like, yeah, that's been done a million times. Maybe try to shy away from that. And then like, yeah, the banter thing. I think for the banter, like there's such thing as negging. And I think sometimes male authors forget that negging is something that is not fun. It's actually really gross. So if you don't know what negging is, it's essentially just, like trying to intentionally, like the way you flirt with someone is to try to tear them down, which is, there's a fine line, right? Because there can be gentle teasing, but the moment it starts to become like bullying somebody to get what you want out of them, that's when it starts to be like, women will read that and be like, oh, a guy wrote this. Like, okay, yeah. Like they really just don't get how to flirt. That's how it comes across. Like it comes across like a lack of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. And in terms of teens, I think like kids acting like adults, like, look, I say this as somebody who kind of just wrote a book about that, with that as kind of the thing. And my next book actually is very different from it. But yeah, it has been done a lot. I still think you can do it. Because I think it's something that people do want, but you just have to be aware of what's been done before and just try to make them interesting in other ways. So that's the thing. Sometimes you might fall into a cliche. You might fall into something that has been done a lot, but you can get around it. You can have some compromises, I think. Stonefrost Faith writes, an original character is always a good character. Avoid creating a flawless Mary Sue that because she just believed in herself, she turned better fighter than a veteran Spartan hoplite, greater footballer than Messi, smarter than Napoleon, more charming than Alexander of Macedon, more socialist than Marx, sexier than my wife, and of course a strong, independent, pretty woman that every man desires, yet she is attracted to the same sex. You may have some of these traits. She is the protagonist after all, but if you provide reasons why she is the way she is, or simply grant her skills or increase the ones she already possesses, along the way of the story and a character arc, your protagonist will feel natural and human. Personally, despite watching Xena passionately as a kid, I wouldn't be interested in reading a book about her right now. Hey, different strokes, but yeah, this is the thing. Look, if you are going to do the tropes, right? If you are going to do the Mary Sue thing of like, they're so powerful, the thing you can still subvert that. You can still use that trope, even though it's a bit cliche, but you could comment on that. Your story could be about like why Mary Sues are so problematic, right? Or it could be about like, or you just give explanations that are really compelling. Why is this character, this woman, so good at fighting? Maybe there's a reason that is actually kind of sad, that makes the character more interesting and tragic because, like Brienne of Tarth in Song of Ice and Fire, right? She is like this awesome, like super good, knight warrior or whatever. But that's the thing is like, she's a strong warrior for reasons that are tragic. Her appearance, her insecurities. She thinks that she'll never, she's like conflicted between like wanting to have a connection with a man, but feeling like none of them will ever like return her love. So she channels it into being the loyal good knight. But that ultimately is her resisting the true part of herself. So yeah, you have a character that's maybe like a Mary Sue, like, oh, she wins every fight. But what makes her interesting is how that strength limits her, how it takes things away from what she thinks will make her happy, right? So you have to find ways to make the character interesting while still leaning into some tropes sometimes. Because imagine if, you had somebody writing Brienne of Tarth, if you had George R. R. Martin writing Brienne of Tarth and somebody was like, well, I don't want to see any books anymore where the female knight is super good at fighting all the time. And you're like, oh, I want to avoid that trope. Like, no, of course not. Like, like sometimes you can overly listen to other people, if that makes sense. All right, let's do one more comment here. Proserpina, the fantasy romance subreddit would be a good place for you to go in order to get a sense of people's tastes and how varied they can be. For as much as some people hate an insecure female protagonist who just can't understand how any guy could like her, there are some people that love that S-I-H-I. For as much as some people hate a plucky teenage genius, there's some people that love that S-H-I-T. As long as it makes sense within the story, you'll find an audience for just about anything. Here's a whole rant that I just went on about that. So they linked to another thing that they wrote in the subreddit. So yeah, we'll link to this prompt if you want to read some of the other reactions that people had. But I think that about covers it. I think that there's a lot of good advice here. And, even though I kind of stumbled a little bit in my reaction, because yeah, I do think it's complicated sometimes to talk about gender with this stuff, especially as I know like a lot of people who listen to this show are male authors. And so I want to be really careful. And I think the number one thing, because I look at the analytics, I know most of you are guys. And here's the thing. If you are writing a female character, number one thing is be respectful. Don't be a sexist piece of you-know-what. And just try to always look at the humanity behind the gender. Gender impacts a lot of things. Gender impacts your role in society. It impacts, like physical aspects of you, obviously. But one of the things that makes somebody kind of bigger than their gender, first of all, is how they use their gender sometimes, or how they kind of resist their gender, or in many cases, how they, don't conform, like them not conforming to society can sometimes be a connection to how their gender role might be unconventional. And as long as you're being smart about this sort of thing and you are trying to, again, be respectful of the differences between, your main character and, the other people in the story and what makes them special, then a lot of this stuff, even if you do make a mistake, that's fine. Don't fret. You're not a terrible person if you make a mistake. But the important thing is to just rely on other people's insights and their reactions to just get a better read and to, control, keep your story under control, and you'll get better at this as time goes on. I think that, the way I wrote female characters, very early on, was very lame. It was in a way that I was not ready to write female main characters, especially. And that's why my first fantasy novel, I had two main characters, one male, one female. And that was an experience where I started to really figure that character out with more experience, because that was a much longer novel. And it just took time. These things do. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Bridget Surdock. Can't wait for them to react to this. This is going to be a fun one for them. But thanks for listening. Don't go away, though. Going to be right back. And we're back. And a little bit of an update to the programming. Wasn't exactly expecting this, but our producer, Natalia Emmons, actually sent me something right after we finished recording the last thing. And she said, hey, you know what? There actually is another prompt on this same topic that I almost sent you, but I want you to take a look at it now, because just based on how this last conversation went, it might be also interesting. And it was written pretty recently. So this is one of those things where it's like a confluence of circumstances. A lot of folks are very curious right now about, female protagonists, I guess. But all right, so I'm going to take a look at this prompt. The only thing I've seen so far is the headline of it. I don't really know, and also what Talia has already mentioned, but I'm going to look at that, and then we'll still take a look, of course, at Bridget Surdock's notes. They sent that over very, very quickly. So I'm going to do this prompt real quick, maybe have a little bit of commentary, do the notes, and then go from there. This is probably going to be our longest episode, but I think it's worth it, considering this is a pretty big topic and a very interesting one at that. So, okay, this comes to us from username No More Conk, and they write, they make it harder than it really is. So this is just my opinion, but I feel that creating good female characters is overrated. Okay, we're going to keep going with this one, but all right. Not in the sense that it's not a good thing and necessary and etc. But I'm always hearing, quote, this ex-creator understands how to write female characters, video tutorials, or how to write female characters well, and etc. I understand that this may come from the fact that there is a whole context of lack of good female characters in artistic works, but I feel that they make making good female characters seem more difficult than it really is, as something that few understand and that takes a process. And I personally think it's just making a good character who happens to be a woman. It's as easy as not writing female characters based on stereotypes and prejudices and gender roles. Even from my opinion, I feel that it is like the discussion that I have seen some people have. A distinction should be made between good art and good art made by women. Well-written books by women. What would it mean to make a good female character? What would make it different from just making a good character? I've seen women ask about how to write good male characters, but the discussion has always revolved around writing women, so that's why I focus more on that. But still, after all this, I feel that my thinking has many sides to be discussed, and it is a discussion that I would like to enter into. I also want to clarify that I don't think making good female characters is overrated. Isn't that what they said, though? Whatever. What I mean is that I think the process of making good female characters is overrated. Okay, I guess I see the distinction you're making there. Now, okay, like I do feel this. I definitely feel this. And there's a lot of good in this. I think that the whole idea, like what they're talking about, comes from a place of there's so much attention on writing female characters well, almost like it's like missing the forest for the trees, right? It's like, well, why are we obsessing so much? Like, it should just be about making a good character who happens to be a woman. And that is also my thinking as well. I think the exception, obviously, is when you get into a story where their gender plays a more crucial component into the plot itself. We mentioned Poppy War earlier. That is a major aspect of Poppy War. You don't really have that same character and a lot of the same plot circumstances in that book work if she is not a woman, right? But there are other books where it's not as consequential to the plot that the main character is a woman. Mistborn, the other book, the series that we mentioned before. So all that context to say, the idea of, or this phenomenon where you have all these videos about like writing strong female characters, I think the reason there's like an enterprise for that, and I'm participating in it as well, is because we're in an environment where most of the people reading fantasy at the moment, especially YA, are women. Women account for the most readers right now in a lot of genres, if not all of them. And a big thing is just like men aren't really reading books, or at least they're not reading creative fiction. And for that reason, there are a lot of writers who happen to be women as well, because the people reading books are women. And so we have a lot of writers who are women. But that doesn't mean we don't also have male writers. As I mentioned before, a lot of people listening to this show are men or, male or whatever. And you then run into this conundrum, right? As a man, okay, well, the market is mostly female. I want my book to be successful. You're probably in a situation where like, I don't mind reading books with female main characters, but maybe you're concerned that if you don't write a female main character, then women aren't going to read the book or engage with it, which, look, yeah, there's going to be some of that, but it happens in both directions and it's marginal. How many people read Harry Potter, for example, right? Harry Potter was arguably read more by women than it was by men if you account for everything. I don't know that for sure, but I'm just, guessing. But also Harry Potter written by a woman, right? Not a great woman, but what are you going to do? And that said, there are just lots of books that it's not the same gender in terms of the main character and the protagonist. Like I was saying before, you aren't obligated to write your own gender. You're obligated to tell a good story. And this whole thing too, Oh, well, actually, first, let me make sure I finish my thought from before. My thought from before was that I think the reason there are all these videos and tutorials, and yeah, I can see why it gets under your skin. I can see why it's a little bit like, geez, like, do we have to make such a fuss about this? I think the function of it really comes down to there are a lot of male authors who do want to do the work. They do want to write a good female character, and they know that they're, ostensibly at a supposed disadvantage because they are not women. And so they don't know all the ins and outs, or like they feel like they might make a mistake and they might be sensitive to that. And that's a good thing, like I want to make sure I do this well. I don't want to write a female character and it's terrible and I'm going to offend a lot of people who would, really like my book. And you don't want to be put in that unpleasant, uncomfortable situation. So I think all of that tracks. And so they seek out these resources because I think there are a lot of like good advice threads in these things that kind of lay out a lot of what we're talking about of like, all right, focus on the character and stay in your lane when it's right, and then branch out a little bit or take a back road when, you feel a little bit more prepared and confident to do that. But the main point is that if you're kind of sick of this commentary on like why does why do we have to have a whole YouTube video about this? Or, why is everybody obsessed with this? I think a lot of it comes from a good place. Maybe some of it doesn't, but I think a lot of it does, where it's just people genuinely in good faith just want to write good characters, and they understand that they might have some deficiencies or some things that they can get better at in this respect. And I'll admit, I've never particularly engaged in that. For me, I haven't looked up like, how do I write a good... I think for me, it's just I've relied upon the books that I know I like. And I try to when I've tried to write female characters, I've just intuitively been judging myself critically in terms of like, what about this character could be better? And in some cases, yeah, it has to do with, their gender identity, or it has to do with, have I really thought through how their gender affects their personality, where they're at in the world, all this stuff. But I don't know. I definitely see that side of it, which is like, maybe we don't have to like try to break it down to some kind of like science. Like there's some kind of inherent virtue to like, I'm so proud of myself. I wrote a strong female character who is great. It's like, okay, like relax, like you should be proud of your work, but it's, it's part of the job. I guess I should say it's part of doing your job as a writer, which is writing a compelling character, no matter their genre. And in that case, a lot, one of the trickier places to evaluate yourself is like, yeah, maybe you put a lot of attention into your main character, your female protagonist, but what about your female side characters? Take an honest look at your book. What is the ratio of how many characters you wrote that are men versus women? And this is something I noticed on one of my first books. I think it was like my third book, where I realized like, gosh, I just subconsciously default to like these characters being men. So I had like one female character for every like 4 men characters. And that's an easy trap to fall into as a guy, because you just see the world and like, and then, maybe some women too, because it's a patriarchal society, right? And for me, like I would just default to, the butler is going to be a guy right immediately in my head. And so there have been times, I've gotten better about this with experience, but early on, I definitely was running into this where I would look at it and be like, wow, most of my characters here are men. Why is that? Well, it's not because I'm a bad person necessarily. It's just, I have like a set way of thinking that I should challenge and get better at. And, in that case, I didn't have to have somebody call me out for it, but I probably would have and should have rightfully been called out for it if it had gotten to that point. But that's all to say is like, you can catch these things yourself and, definitely find yourself more prepared without having to, like bring something out into the world recklessly, I guess. I do want to read at least one comment here. I like this one. It's from Tasty Hearing. They write, most people that seem to have trouble writing the opposite sex seem to also have never really talked to anyone of the opposite sex, or they just don't understand how a personality works. A little harsh, but I get what they're saying. I think for me, I grew up with, 2 sisters. I grew up reading like C.S. Friedman. I grew up reading stuff that like wasn't strictly for boys, even down to like when I would play with my older sister, we would play Barbies a lot. And I remember just like, there was like a little bit of in the back of my head, like, oh, there's supposed to be shame for me playing dolls, I guess. But because I love my sister so much and we were such good friends growing up, because she was the only sibling I had close to my age, I just wanted to like be around her and engage with her. And, we would play with like these Barbies and we would come up with these like, wild scenarios. And I'd be honest, I think a lot of that, really helped me shape like understanding my sister better. Both of my sisters were always just such great role models. They would always tell me like, hey, this is how you should treat a woman. They were telling me stuff like this when I was like 5, 6 years old. And it's something that I didn't even realize was uncommon. At least I don't know how uncommon, but I didn't realize that a lot of guys don't have the same sort of thing growing up until I was much older. But like literally like my sisters would be like, hey, if a girl says no, like that's that. Right. And so they worked really hard to try to instill in me, this attitude of like, hey, like treat people with respect, treat women with respect, because we live in a day and age where women are routinely, disrespected by men. I think a lot of this was a result too of like growing up in a Latino household and like Latino machismo, like the very toxic men of like Latino, culture that's very common, unfortunately. I think that's just something that Latino women are very aware of. And so that might be a cultural thing too. I don't know how normalized it is in like, I guess like white American, households. Technically I'm white American, but I'm like Puerto Rican and I don't know, we don't have to get into it, but it's different. I'll just say that. But that's just one aspect of it, right? Of like regularly engaging with the opposite sex, regularly making friends, with women, wherever you can without any intention, beyond that, which I understand is a whole fraught topic. But yeah, I mean, how many times have you had like a deep conversation with a woman? I think as guys, we're taught so much to just repress everything and, to show weakness. I dealt with this. I have an older brother and he would always he would do the opposite of my sisters or try to, and he would try to, coach me, right? Of like, you need to be like, you need to like neg women. You need to like be a jerk and that's how you get them to like you. And it just always really bugged me because A, that wasn't who I was. And B, I just felt like, why would I be a jerk to somebody? Like if that's what it takes for them to like me and for me to have a conversation with them, then I don't want to have a conversation with them. That's weird. That's just me. me, right? And I'm not impugning anybody or judging anybody else. I know everybody's circumstances, their temperaments, their personalities are going to be different. But that's all to say, I think that having just basic empathy, is part of this, like, yes, having a conversation with the opposite sex, but like having these conversations because you just want to connect with people, whether they be, women, non-binary, trans, whatever. Like, you just want to talk to people and know their story and ask them questions and be interested in who they are and, for who they are, right? A lot of that too is like, hopefully people engage with you in the same way. And that inspires you to be like, wow, I just met this stranger and they were so interested in me. And maybe that takes you off guard. But you can, pass that along to other folks in a way that's like really, uplifting. And so a little positive message for you all there. I got to read this comment too, because it's from Proserpina, who commented in the other thing. Fantastic. Maybe this is the rant actually that they were linking to. Oh, this might be the case. So maybe that's why Natalia sent me this. Natalia, you dastardly dog. All right. I'm sorry for calling you a dastardly dog. That was impolite. All right. So Proserpina writes, every time I hear someone make this argument, they aren't actually willing to discuss women. They just stop at the shallow argument that, quote, writing a woman well is just writing a character well, seemingly because they don't like the idea that there is a skill and knowledge required to writing women, and they would rather stay at the surface level arguing the merit of this. Here's the thing. What is the difference between you saying, quote, writing women should just be writing people, and 18th century doctors who didn't think women's health had to be a thing because they thought the differences between men and women were surface level? When your fight against sexism circles and horseshoes right back into there is no difference between women and men, so we shouldn't have to focus on or think about women as a unique experience from men, logic, you should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque. So before you decide that writing a woman well is just writing a person well and separate skill and knowledge isn't necessary to write women from those non-women characters, let's discuss. They're about to go into something else, but I do want to say, like, this is a great argument. And I think that it's definitely like the flip side, like the dark side of like, just focus on writing a good character. Well, here's the thing, and I'm glad that Proserpina is bringing this up. Part of writing a good character well is knowing and understanding their gender, like I was saying before, and knowing how their gender affects them. And so that's why I was a little hesitant before to be like, oh yeah, if you just change the gender of your character, would they be exactly the same? That's not necessarily a good thing, because gender in all kinds of things, even fantasy, should be very specific to people's experiences and all of that. And so you do have to show some awareness and understanding in terms of like what you're doing, because you have to be responsible with your story. And I think Proserpina is exactly right. It does take some skill. It does take some knowledge. And that's why I think those YouTube videos, those tutorials, they can be really valid, because as a male author, if you're a male author listening to this, then yeah, you should take it like that of like, this is something that, I'm not going to be super great at right away, most likely, but I can improve at and, be better at over time and really train myself up and all of that. So I think that that's a really good point that Proserpina is bringing up. So they also went on to say, and so they put like a numbered list of like things to discuss. Let's go through it. Number 1, how is the writer world building the in-story society treatment of women? Are they going for a feminist, idealized, realistic, traditionalist, romanticized, or cynical approach to how the society treats women, let alone if this is a modernized or historical value system? Is the author supposed to know all of this political and philosophical history beforehand, or will some research be required to determine this tone? Yeah, I think this is what I was talking about before too. It depends on the fantasy story, right? And it's a great question to ask about your world when you set out. It's like, okay, well, how important is gender and, sexism and stuff in a certain world? My most recent book is a pirate fantasy, and it's a second world. And I decided that I don't want there to be like a strict patriarchy. It's more of a society where there are patriarchies and matriarchies here and there. It's more about religious oppression, because I wanted that to be the focus instead. But, one of the other reasons too is that I wanted one of the main villains to be a woman, and based on the role capacity she has in the story, it wouldn't make sense for her to be in the situation she was in a patriarchal sort of thing. So it's a matriarchal thing, but it's not saying like matriarchy bad. It just happens to be matriarchy in this sense. And that's not really part of the theme or the story or anything like that. So yeah, this is a great question to ask. Proserpina goes on, and we should probably just link to this because it's really long and we don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I really appreciate that they added all of this because I think that it's probably going to be very helpful for folks. And, we've read Proserpina's comments before on the show. They seem very, very knowledgeable about this stuff and have given great advice to a lot of the folks in this community. So, okay, let's move on to Bridget Surdach's notes. Producer Bridget had quite a lot to say, and I'm going to do my best to unpack this. Very excited as always. Bridget writes, finally dropping the Pixar theory lore, only 18 episodes in. Yeah, I guess I haven't talked about the Pixar stuff that much. We did have a commenter who realized I was the Pixar theory guy. We have it in the show notes because I have it as part of the books I've written. And yeah, the Pixar theory, that whole thing, it's not super relevant to fantasy writing, which is why I haven't brought it up much because it's a nonfiction. But, it's fun to bring it up when we can. Maybe we will again soon. Bridget says this and directs it toward the original poster, which I think their username is Shoddy Elephant. Enemies to lovers is not a cliche, it's a trope. I agree. I know we had a whole thing about cliches. Sometimes tropes can be cliche, but honestly, enemies to lovers is just so kind of foundational to a lot of romances that just calling it a cliche, I think it's like very dismissive in a way that I don't appreciate. A lot of folks just really like enemies to lovers. I think the thing that can be cliche is how you do enemies to lovers can be cliche, if that makes sense. What you should do is you should take the trope, and maybe it's an overused trope, but that's an opportunity, not a weakness. You can take the enemies to lovers trope and find a very original way to do it in a way that's engaging and that you get something out of. I actually forgot to mention this, and it was something that I was thinking while I was reading that prompt before from the other user, but because they were writing about what makes the story good or what makes a female character written well. I really like the way that Anthony Jeselnik described comedy in this way. It's very similar. It's a different thing, but similar. So Anthony Jeselnik was talking sort of about cancel culture in terms of stand-up comedians complaining that they're getting canceled, that they can't be joking anymore. And Jeselnik, who is a very edgy comedian, mind you, he said that he doesn't buy any of that stuff. And his main thing is what makes a joke, the point of it or the secret to it is or telling a good joke is getting away with it. A joke is funny if you get away with it. And so if you tell this joke and it offends a bunch of people and it puts you in the news, that's not you being censored. That's you not getting away with it. And it wasn't, necessarily, quote, funny, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's writing a female character and getting away with it. Yes, you are a man maybe writing a female protagonist, but getting away with it means that you have done it in a way that works, in a way that doesn't invite all this criticism. Now people are always going to criticize everything, not everyone's going to laugh at, a stand-up comics joke, but it's more about the aggregate in that context. So thanks, Bridget, because what you wrote there really sparked that for me to remember that. Bridget said, you telling yourself, be careful here, was so cute and relatable. Yeah, I definitely was having a moment. I was like, okay, because again, I'm speaking from a position of there are so many things about this topic that I'm just not going to be the expert in. Obviously, I want to share my insights. I want to share my opinions, but I am definitely not do not just listen to me about this stuff because I can only tell you my experience and I'll do the best I can, but you need well-rounded opinions on this sort of thing, which is probably another reason why Natalia sent that prompt over, because it's nice to get multiple perspectives. You can get exposed to all of them and make determinations based on that. So there you go. Bridget wrote, fully agree that you shouldn't let what you make be controlled or tainted by what other people do or don't want to see. At least not in the way that OP is asking it. And they shouldn't be worried about it too much this early on. Make the character, don't worry about the cliches just yet, just make the character. Emphasis on character here and not female character. Yeah, I definitely agree. Again, it's one of those things where if you're writing the character and they aren't compelling, part of it could be that you aren't really fully thinking through them as a 3D character and how their gender plays into certain things. So again, it just depends on the story and a lot of this stuff. It really just depends on the story. And you really don't want your originality to just be, like the other person was saying, a checklist of my main character is awesome. Look at this checklist of things I made sure that they weren't. It's who's going to buy that, honestly? Bridget wrote, writing female characters is not inherently any harder than writing male characters. You write the character, you give them bonds, flaws, and ideals. The gender of it all is secondary to the character, at least in this regard. The gender of it all is still important and will be a fundamental part of who your character is. But the bonds, flaws, and ideals don't or will not be decided solely on their gender. Yeah, I like that clarification at the end. It's gender's part of it, but if you try to make gender solely part of it, I think that's where, what I was saying before, how it can come off as patronizing. It can come off as, reductive to, honestly, the way that gender plays a part in our daily lives. I think that trying to describe a person and being oh, why do you love this person? Oh, they're so, hot, or something. Or it's well, go under the surface. Yeah, sure, you're physically attracted
to your partner and they are a woman and you're very happy about that or something. But go deeper. What is special about that person? What makes them who they are? Gender is just like the starting point in some situations of like descriptors, right? And they can inform a lot of like aspects of who the person is and how they were raised. But you need a full character here. This isn't, that's the skill and knowledge, right? The skill and knowledge comes into writing great characters and understanding how their different, personality traits inform each other, overlap with each other, make sense of the other. And if you try to remove gender from it and it's like, gender doesn't matter, then yeah, it's like, it kind of reminds me, and I'm thinking of that other post right now too. It kind of reminds me of how some people think like they misconstrue what Martin Luther King Jr. said about, people being judged for the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so there's like this reaction to that over the decades of like, oh, that means that I should just pretend, that like people with darker skin are, like just be colorblind, right? It's like, oh, I don't see race, I don't see color or whatever. It's like, yeah, you do. Like those things still persist. They're still part of like who a person is, their ethnicity, their cultural background, because that's the reality of life. We don't live in a colorblind society. We live in a society with systems where, yes, your race and your gender determine a lot of things. And if you write a book where that stuff is just completely missing, where there's no like influence there whatsoever, you have a lot of work you have to do to make sense of that, right? So again, that's not to say that every book has to be about race or every book has to be about gender issues. It just means that your world needs to be vivid and it needs to feel authentic for a lot of reasons. And you have to make sure you're just cognizant of how gender could potentially play a role. And then in cases where it doesn't, just be ready to answer for that so that people understand and don't, dismiss your book out of hand. Bridget writes, I agree with you about George R. R. Martin's sexism in A Song of Ice and Fire. I think he's getting the broad strokes of it all correctly, but the details, the emotional feel, it's wrong. Yeah, I'll say with Martin, with A Song of Ice and Fire in particular, I think where Martin usually gets it right is with his like main female characters. So Arya, Sansa, Daenerys. I think for the most, Daenerys is more of a mixed bag. And I would say Catelyn Stark too, in my opinion. But he tends to do better with those characters. I think where he typically falters is with a lot of the secondary characters, background characters, and just, like Gilly, for example. That's where a lot of like my criticisms personally come in. But again, it's like criticizing a book with a lot of great stuff in it. You don't want to be reductive and be like, that means no one should read it. Like, no. Like, just saying it has flaws, Who would have thought a human writing a book means that it's going to be a human book with flaws in it? That happens. Bridget writes, also a personal thing, but I don't love reading a book where sexism is a major issue in the world. Reading is an escape, and I don't really want my escape to have the same problems I'm trying to run from. Don't love it in movies either, but I tolerate it better there because that's about 2 hours of my life, as opposed to the 20 plus it takes to read a book. Yeah, so I've come across this sentiment as well, right? Where there is sort of a desire from folks in terms of a lot of these issues to look at fantasy as a place where we have an opportunity here because it's fantasy to not have to dwell on these issues. Now, look, you can have those books. You can have something like The Handmaid's Tale, for example, but those books are going to be a little bit more literary. They're going to be a little bit more like, okay, there's a point that is a little bit broader or there's an allegory. Sometimes it's not very subtle, where I think that fantasy can sort of get away from that and investigate other issues that aren't talked about as much. Kind of similar to how like horror movies tend to be about grief, for example, and horror books tend to be about like, unresolved traumas and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that is fine. It's just, you have to be very careful when you are trying to bring up a topic like sexism without making it the sole focus of the book, if that's not your intention. Because if your intention is to write a book about sexism, just know that there's some folks who don't want to engage with that because, yeah, this is a genre where maybe they just want the action adventure. They want the swashbuckling, what have you. It doesn't mean that, there aren't gender things that happen, right? That doesn't mean you don't have a scene where you have a guy, talking trash to a woman, like in a bar or something like that. Okay. I agree that a well-rounded character could not simply have their gender swapped. But I would argue that at this stage in OP's development, it probably could be. The character isn't well fleshed out yet or solidified. They could change the gender at this point if they wanted. But doing so would inherently change the way the character will be fleshed out as they go. Yeah, I've run into this where If I've waited too long and I've been like, oh, this character would work better if I switched the gender, and then it wouldn't work because I realized that, like, yeah, in this case, swapping the gender is too drastic of a change. You know, too much of this character's personality and how I envision them. It just starts to feel false. Like, I'm like, wait, no, like, that's not this character. Sorry, not the case. Cheers to that first commenter. God, yes. Ignore the cliches. Make the character. Also wrote, Arcane friggin' slaps. Yeah, Arcane's good. Arcane's a good show. Second season's out. I think it's just going to be the 2 seasons. I haven't seen all of Arcane, by the way. Bridget writes, I think OP has the right idea about wanting to avoid cliches, but is fully going about this the wrong way. It's the epitome of the he a little confused, but he got the spirit meme. Yeah, that's like, so Bridget sent over like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air reference there because I forgot about this. This is an old one. As you said, as all these commenters said, writing a character matters more than avoiding or breaking cliches. If somehow you're still struggling with writing a female character, I don't know, talk to women. Actually, better than that, listen to women. And not just about how to write women, but about their lives, their struggles, their joys. Women are as interesting and three-dimensional as men. And if all you can think of when trying to write women are cliches, first of all, not your fault, we live in a patriarchal society, then try to get to know them better. Read feminist literature, watch female-led and directed movies, watch interviews with women in all walks of life. I really like that last one, by the way. Some of the most famous writing advice is to write what you know. So if you don't know how to write women, get to know them, and the rest will fall into place. I love that Bridget brings up that in particular because people think like write what you know means that like, well, I'm screwed. I don't know anything. No. Or like, oh, write what you know, but I'm not a woman. That means I can't write no, you can know women, you know, or it's like, well, I can't write this book about firefighters because I'm not a firefighter. Get to know a firefighter, learn firefighting. Like, you know how many books get published where like, you're not going to believe this, but I am not a fortune teller pirate. Therefore, me, John Negroni, I'm not. But you know what? I'm still going to write a pirate novel about a fortune teller. What are you going to do? Also, would recommend reading queer literature. The Trans Manifesto would be a big help, I've no doubt. Actually, I think I'm confusing a few different queer manifestos and stuff. My quick Googling of Trans Manifesto is pulling up medical stuff. Interesting, but not terribly helpful for OP. But I do think trans literature would help. Yeah, and I think that's part of this too. I think we're in a generation where a lot of people are on YouTube, right? They're on TikToks and things, and you know, even little steps like that. If you're a guy, there is an algorithm that I think is designed to expose you to male-centered ideas. We just live in a society where algorithms are geared toward a lot of misogynist content. But you can get away from that and follow a bunch of women on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, and what have you. And that can also be a way of like just listening to women and just kind of, you know, I know it can be a little cliche at times. It's like, just listen to the, you know, we need to have conversations about having conversations. I don't want to, I'm not talking about that wishy-washy crap. But what I am talking about is the number one thing you should be if you're a writer. That's an observer. Being observant and not in a judging way, not in a I'm ready to pounce on this person if they say something I don't like sort of way. Writing is taking what you've observed and putting it into play. A lot of what you observe happens when you're walking around and you just notice things happening in everyday life. Being more observant in the workplace, being more observant at a kid's soccer game, whatever it is, you should be paying close attention to the world around you because it's going to teach you so many things. And if your whole world is just one dopamine hit after dopamine hit of the same stuff and content coming at you from a screen over and over again, that's going to be what kind of dulls you, honestly, to originality, innovation, and things that actually get your mind going, that inspire you. Sometimes, you know, and counter to what I just said, maybe just turn off TikTok, turn off Instagram and all that stuff. Turn off your phone. Just get in your car and drive, or, you know, go for a run and just be in the silence for a minute. And a lot of the time too, is like, let's say you have a conversation with a woman and you listen to them and you get to know their story and they're so fascinating. What do you do right after that? Get on your phone and get exposed to something else that just starts to crowd all that information you just absorbed? No, just turn everything off for a minute. Let the things that you're observing and you're bringing in your daily life, let them marinate, let them sit with you. Turn stuff off. Listen to lo-fi if you want to listen to something, but just listen to something that's going to get your mind going and decompressing and just being present with all this information so that you're actually digesting it and you're internalizing it. It doesn't mean that you're going to, all the information coming to you, you're going to be like blindly or undyingly, like you're not going to question or anything like that. Of course not. What you're really doing is you are wrestling with it and you're critically thinking through it. And that is just not just good advice for writing. That's just good advice for being a person, you know, and just getting through life. So hopefully we'll end it there. We'll end it on a pretty positive note, I hope. Thank you so much for everything y'all have done for the show. Natalia Emmons and Bridget Surdock, our two wonderful producers, for helping us out with this one. This was a hefty one, and I definitely really appreciate all the extra nods that we got in there toward all of this. And for those of you who've listening, I hope this has been helpful and insightful. Very interested to read the comments on this one, but I hope we did a good job regardless. If you have your own advice prompt for Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, all you have to do is email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Let us know if you have a question or something you want us to bring up on the show. Also, you can comment. We have our YouTube channel. We're tracking those all the time. You can find our podcast right there or on whatever podcast app of choice you have. If you have a podcast app and we're not on there, let us know. We'll try to get on there as soon as we can. But with that, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.